morning, everybody. On behalf of Franklin County Business and Professional Women's, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. One of the important things that the organization does is to help educate our members and the community on upcoming legislative issues that might affect all of us. During election year, the organization plays a leadership role in the organizing a legislative candidates forum like this one. Our partners in tonight's forum include St. Albans City and St. Albans Town, Franklin County Caring Community and Watershed Mentoring, Franklin County Regional Chamber of Commerce, Northwest Regional Planning Commission, Northwest Counseling and Supportive Services, Northwest Medical Center, St. Albans Museum, and the United Way of Northern Vermont. We are all excited to be here tonight to give you the opportunity to make informed decisions about how you will vote in November. I now turn the room over to the moderator for tonight's event, Joe Halko, from Northwestern Counseling and Supportive Services. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. We're going to change the mic in a moment here, but thank you, Bonnie. We'll begin this evening's candidate forum by focusing on the race for the Vermont State Senate. What I would like is if the four candidates could please come forward. We have you situated alphabetically at the table here. Oh, that's okay. All right. Okay. So what I'd like to do is introduce the candidates in alphabetical order and with their party affiliation. We have Senator Randy Brock, Republican, Pam McCarthy, Democrat, Representative Corey Parent, Republican, and Dustin Tanner, Democrat. Now, this evening, the questions will focus on the areas of economic development, healthcare, education, and gun legislation. Candidates will have 2 minutes to answer each question, with the exception of the final question, in which they'll have 30 seconds to respond. Our timekeeper, Kathy, will flash a card when there's 30 seconds remaining, and then we'll ring the bell. Trish, if you'll ring the bell so they can hear the bell. I love the bell. There we go. That's when your time is up. Now, I would hope that each of you will respect each other's time, and if someone continues to talk past the ringing of the bell, I'll respectfully ask the next candidate to begin answering. Candidates will address questions in alphabetical order, with Senator Brock answering the initial question first, followed by Ms. McCarthy, who will then be the first person to answer the second question, and will continue to rotate through all the questions. As you listen to the candidates' answers, I'd like to ask that the audience please hold your applause until the very end of the session, so that we have time to go through as many questions as possible. So with that being said, we're ready to start, and the very first question is, as you may be aware, Vermont is a state which is viewed in many circles as being unfriendly to businesses. We continually lose opportunities to land new businesses to states like New York, and we have also lost a number of Vermont businesses that have chosen to relocate to other states. How would you encourage fellow legislators to create a friendlier business climate? And we begin with Senator Brock.
A great deal of our problem in getting new businesses to come to Vermont stems from the fact that Vermont is perceived as not a great place to do business. One of the things that I have certainly suggested to the administration is to start by putting a sign up at every place that says, "Welcome to Vermont," to add, "We're open for business." and then to adopt policies that confirm that. If you talk to people as to why they won't come to Vermont, the first thing that typically I hear is regulation. The second I hear is taxes. The third I hear is just the general difficulty of doing business in Vermont. And as we look at how our government is organized, it is almost a form of hostility when it comes to businesses that want to come to Vermont. Because rather than having a simple, easy to operate, easy to function way of registering a business, we take people from pillar to post, from office to office, and we do it sequentially. We don't necessarily do things all at once. This is one of the major problems in permitting, for example. We have permitting that's scattered all over state government rather than one central place, an agency of permitting where all the permitting activities of the various state organizations are centered under one roof. And where a business of a particular size that wants to come to Vermont, we assign them one person who is responsible for actually doing it. Right now, everyone is responsible and no one is responsible. And when you try to get a permit, so often, when you're 90% along in the process, the one person who has to do the next step goes on a 2-week vacation and everything stops. Attitude and the way we approach things is the first and probably most important thing to change Vermont's reputation as a place to where it is good to do business.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McCarthy?
I've been listening carefully to businesses as I've campaigned across Franklin County. I hear that many businesses, especially our farms, struggle with the costs of doing business in Vermont. I have been a small business owner in St. Albans, and I know the joys and the challenges of this role. I want to work collaboratively with fellow legislators in a creative way and build on the Vermont brand. Vermont is celebrated for our quality of life and our education, as well as our health and well-being. These factors can be These factors can be a draw for employers and for much-needed workers and their families. Vermont needs to grow jobs and revenues. The role of government is not to give handouts to a few businesses here or there, but to make sure that businesses get a fair shake and that entrepreneurs can thrive here, from the farmer making value-added products to a small manufacturer moving from the garage to the industrial park. I hear Vermont's smallest businesses I hear from Vermont's smallest businesses that the regulations designed for large businesses are stifling their growth. Small business is the engine of our economy. Specifically, we need to better support our farmers markets, our shared workspaces, and our food hubs. We need to have smart zoning and land use practices that make it easier to build in places where it's appropriate, like downtowns and industrial parks. Even while we protect and invest in preserving Vermont's working landscapes. We need to improve our internet and cell phone access. We also need to re-examine our tax structures so that small businesses don't bear an unfair share of the costs. Our over-reliance on property taxes hits non-residential property owners, like many Vermont businesses, the hardest. Vermont can do better promoting our manufactured and value-added products for export and making sure that our education system builds the skills of the employees that businesses need. I'm excited about the idea of piggybacking new fast fiber optic internet service on existing utility lines to better connect Vermont businesses to the world. I'm an optimist. I say the glass is half full.
Thank you. Representative Parent?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I think we all in this room, or at least most of us, can agree that a growing economy and growing business is good for Vermont. Randy and I were able to, work on legislation this year where we were able to make that argument to our colleagues down in Montpelier, me in the House and him in the Senate, where we passed legislation working with all parties, including the administration, to make doing business in Vermont a little easier for some of the largest businesses in Vermont and allowing them to invest their efficiency dollars in a more flexible way. But to be honest with all of you, not everybody in Montpelier thinks growth is good. There are a lot of legislators and there are a lot of organizations in Montpelier that quite frankly see growth as a bad thing for Vermont. They want to see growth contained. They want to see growth not happen organically. They want to pick and choose the industries that they want to happen in. I'll often joke, my first term I was on the House Commerce Committee, and And our chair sat around and goes, what's the next industry that Vermont needs to have? And I go, I bet no one sat here 40 years ago saying, Vermont needs an ice cream company. Two guys, entrepreneurs out of Burlington, had an idea, started selling ice cream, and next thing they grew into one of the largest employers here in Franklin County. So I think what we need to do is send more people down to Montpelier who see growth as a good thing. Growth is critical. We need, as a young Vermonter, and we see it in our school system, population shrinking. Whether it's our home prices, we need people moving in here to grow the demand for all of those things. Growing our economy is good. Growing our economy is the only way we get back to an affordable Vermont, and growing our population is the only way we get back to an affordable Vermont. So the attitude I'll bring to the state Senate is someone who'll see growth as a good thing and not a bad thing.
Thank you. Mr. Tanner?
Well, I think it starts with infrastructure. I think one of the things that Vermont can do is pitch itself as a state. It's a beautiful place to live. We will never be able to cut taxes for businesses like states like New York, because that's impossible. New York has a much broader population base. It's unrealistic. But what we can pitch to people who want to come in and start a business is the beauty that we have. A beautiful lake that we will hopefully work to clean, a beautiful mountainside with the long trail that is accessible pretty much year-round if you're good at hiking in the winter, and a state that has a good education system. The first thing I would do to make businesses, to make Vermont more business friendly is internet. Internet is a big thing. I work in IT in a high school. I see every day where kids that don't have a solid internet connection at home fall behind those who do. You look at a business like Dealer.com that is one of Burlington's biggest businesses now, and they are a internet-based business. They do a lot of their sales with bigger companies based off of being able to have that internet connection. I think we can bring more businesses to Franklin County by expanding broadband and having broadband be countywide. If you have a small business up in Berkshire with no internet connection, you won't be able to organically grow. If you can get accessible internet that is affordable and works all the time, because internet, consolidated communications does not work all the time. If you can get a solid internet, that'll help a lot. Along with improving our infrastructure around our roads and our bridges, I think it's full circle, because then we can go to business and say, we don't have a huge people base. Like, we don't have thousands and thousands of people, but we have a state you want to live in, you have a state you want to play in, and you have a state that we can pitch you on, because you can work anywhere in Vermont.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to the second question. Dairy farmers from across the region are in dire need as milk prices hover around $15 to $16 a hundredweight, well below their production break-even point. Farmers are losing money every day they milk their cows. Please share what you think the long-term impact will be on Franklin County if this trend continues, and is there anything that can be done on a state level to assist our farmers? We'll begin with Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you, Joe. Dairy farming is an integral part of Vermont's economy, and Franklin County is a cornerstone of Vermont's dairy industry. Low milk prices are decimating our farm families, and the vendors associated with dairy farms are suffering as well. If the trend goes on, we'll continue to see farmers making the difficult choice to sell their cows and leave the dairy business. We cannot afford to lose this quintessential piece of Vermont's identity or the economic engine it is for agriculture. Milk accounts for roughly 70% of the state's agricultural sales, 6,000 to 7,000 jobs, and $2.2 billion in economic activity annually. In my conversations with the St. Albans Cooperative Creamery and a few well-known dairy farmers, I'm hearing some things that the state could do to help farmers while we continue to push the feds for much better milk prices and a supply management system. Here are some of their suggestions. Assist dairy farmers with the costs of implementing water quality improvements and consider incentivizing required changes. Attract and keep businesses that use our milk to produce Vermont-branded products in Franklin County. Support more small farmers in their Healthy Roots efforts to ensure locally produced raw milk can be sold to neighbors and local groceries in farmers' communities. Make sure we have high-speed internet access and cell service throughout the state. Our renowned cheeses, ice cream, and other products can be marketed and shipped worldwide more effectively. Promote agritourism and the unique draw of our state's state-of-the-art farming in Vermont, from small to medium to large operations. We need to listen to farmers and to figure out what the future of dairy can be in Franklin County and throughout the state.
Representative Parent?
To put it simply, if this continues for a few more years, we'll have economic and cultural devastation if our dairy industry continues to head this way. Our dairy farmers are in the 4th year of depressed milk prices, which means they've been using up the equity in their farms to stay in business. We also know over the last few months that banks have devalued the price of a cow, which means we've wiped out a lot of their balance sheet as well. Our dairy farmers are in need of a lot of help. Unfortunately, there's not much Vermont can do when it comes to milk prices. However, there are things we can do to help dairy farmers out. First of all, dairy farmers have been villainized the last few years for our water quality issues, yet they're the ones being the leaders on cleaning up water quality. When we look at Lake Carmi, it's the dairy farmers who are taking the lead. Municipalities are dumping millions of gallons of sewage into our waters and not stepping up to the plate like our dairy farmers are. So I think first we need to recognize the good work that they're doing and the millions of dollars they're investing in cleaning up our waterway. We also need to strengthen our right to farm legislation in Vermont. It's dated, and when I talk to dairy farmers, people are coming onto their farms looking for these bad practices in water quality. They're harassing them. They're harassing their business. We need someone who will advocate for these dairy farmers and protect them and their right to do business here in Vermont. I think another issue I'm hearing from dairy farmers that where we could help out as a state is work with the Agency of Agriculture and try to find 1 or 2 people who can really be a liaison with our federal delegation to work on a new farm bill down in Washington, D.C. We can put some resources behind and make sure, Senator Leahy, Senator Sanders, and Congressman Welch are supported by state government in making sure we do this. Dairy's critical not just to the farmer, but right here in St. Albans, whether it's our co-op, Ben & Jerry's, Perigo, Franklin Foods in Enosburg. Dairy is our manufacturing base, not just our economic base. And if we lose dairy, our economy goes with it.
Mr. Tanner?
Milk prices are something, I've been looking into a lot more. Originally, I came from a family farm down in St. George, the Pillsbury Farm, and my family sold because there was no profit in milk. The land is now developed, there's a housing development, there's a solar development, and there's a storage facility there. That farm is no longer producing food. Without farms, we do not have food. I think what we need to do is to help work because, I think at the end game, at the national level, a supply management system such as they have in Canada would be very helpful for some of our farmers in Franklin County. But on the state level, we need to work to help do what we can to, like Pam said, build on the cheeses, build on the products that we have, get these farmers the resources, invest in technology, make farming a cheaper operation, incentivize the cleaning of the lake. Farmers have done a great job in certain parts of Franklin County, and there are some farmers who haven't done a good job either. We should help those farmers who continue to do a good job when it comes to cleaning up the lake. It's really hard to see these milk prices stay down 4 years in a row, right? It's really hard to see because these are people I've grown up with. I went to Enosburg High School and knew half my class was in the FFA, it felt like. And to see their family farms go down while there's really no help and they're getting villainized is not fair to them. These are hardworking Vermonters who deserve just as much assistance as the next guy when it comes to keeping their business afloat. I would like to help get them more technology, help modernize farming practices, and make it so farmers who want to get into the business have a base where they can start, have like a pool of money where a new farmer who wants to start a farm can draw from so they can get a couple of cows, so they can get a building, so they can build and keep the tradition of farming alive in our county.
Senator Brock?
Well, the issues are multifold, and the picture is not good, and the future looks very, very troubling as we look at it. But there are things that we as a state can do despite the fact that we can't control milk prices. That is a federal issue, and our focus with our federal delegation is to further incentivize them, put pressure on them to do what they can to get us a supply management system that actually works. As a state, we can help our farmers because we're imposing requirements on them to do things like help us with water quality. And for that, I believe some investment on our part is both necessary and warranted. It can come in a couple of different ways. We've said that we need about $60 million a year for the next 20 years to clean up the lake. But part of that is to do things that will certainly involve our farmers in terms of perhaps buying up land that may be close to our lakes and may be susceptible to runoff. That will help our farmers. In some cases, we're asking our farmers to make investments, again, for clean water, among other things. Well, one of the things that we can do is look at our bonding capability as to whether or not we can extend some form of tax-exempt bonding so that when they do have to borrow money, it can be at rock-bottom rates, even rates lower than they're getting right now. We can look at branding. The Vermont brand is an extremely valuable brand, but we haven't done as much as we could do to make that brand a forefront in the minds of consumers elsewhere who buy Vermont products. Right now, you can't really buy Vermont milk except in the smallest quantities. The reason is because the milk is bottled somewhere in Massachusetts, where they take the milk from Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and they put it in a big vat, and they combine it. Well, why can't we do something to make them put it in a single vat so that we can sell things as Vermont milk that can, in fact, get a premium?
Thank you. Okay, moving on to healthcare. Given that tobacco use is proven to be a direct driver of healthcare costs, including bronchitis in children and ultimately heart disease and cancer, and recent data that shows 21% of Franklin County youth have used some form of tobacco in the past 30 days, which of these policies would you support to prevent our children from becoming addicted to tobacco in the first place? Either fully funding the tobacco control program to implement the evidence-based prevention and cessation strategies, or implementing a ban on flavored tobacco products. Third is changing the tobacco purchase age to 21, or raising the tobacco tax. And we start with Representative Parent.
Thank you. This is a tough question. It's an emotional question, but sometimes in the legislature you have to remove the emotion from things and look at a broader principle. The one I'd probably be most open to having a conversation on would be option number one. Two, it's tough for me to say we're going to ban a product, especially when we just legalized marijuana as a state of any product. Two, changing tobacco purchase age to 21. I have a hard time telling anybody that I'm asking at 18 to vote for me or to join our military, or 18-year-olds make a lot of bad decisions, and we allow them to. I mean, we let them go $200,000 in debt for art degrees. When you work right down the line, it's part of life. So I have a hard time. I think you're an adult at 18 United States, and so that one I wouldn't support. And then raising taxes, you can do that one, but I think there's enough tax revenue in the state of Vermont to begin with. I think it's an unaffordable place. I would worry about this one is you'd be taking more money out of those pockets of folks who need help feeding their children or feeding their families, but this is a tough addiction to quit. So I get my answer might not be super popular here, but it's a direct one. When you look at the principle of things, at 18 years old, you're an adult. You get to make the decisions you want. Banning a product, I have a hard time banning any product in Vermont, especially at a time when the legislature continues to push for more and more easing on what I think are more dangerous drugs for our children, and I'm not a fan of raising any tax.
Thank you. Mr. Tanner?
I look at all those options on the board, and I don't see an option that is really the big problem in our high schools. We have vaping coming along in our high school. Juuls, the little USB things are about the size of my thumb. So, the thing that I think that would fall under would be the first category is education, is helping people identify how, what these things are, and how we can help our kids who a lot of time come from dangerous situations, low-income homes, not stable homes, who turn to this habit. I think we could help them, and we could help get them to quit. I think we can work on that. I think we do a lot of education. So I would fully fund the educational. That'd be the one I would choose. I would not ban the sales of the products. I would not raise the tax on the product. I think 18-year-olds, like Corey said, I'll agree with Corey on this one. If you can go to war for our country, you should be able to buy a cigarette. That's not popular, and I know that's not popular, but I agree with him on that. But I think it's about education. I think it's about realizing where people are getting these from, educating students on why these are bad, educating young adults, and helping older Vermonters quit. Educational, funds can be used to help fund the quit lines, fund the quitting programs, to help people kick this hard habit. I spent 15 years trying to get my mother to quit smoking. I joined Vermont Kids Against Tobacco. I joined Students Against Destructive Decisions, and finally, after 15 years of pushing, she was able to break that habit. And that's what I draw upon, because for everybody it's different. Some people can quit in a week, some people it'll take 30 years. It's about educating and helping those people.
Senator Brock.
Tobacco control, education, and support are key elements for people in quitting smoking. I know, having quit smoking many, many years ago, what convinced me, among other things, was the publicity that I read about what smoking was doing to people and what I knew it was doing to me. Many times people take a while to get to that point and that realization. And having a robust public education program is critical for that to happen. People have to reach these decisions themselves. You can't reach that decision and you can't make people do that. And that's why the notion of implementing bans on particular types of tobacco, I don't think is really the way to go, and I don't think it's the democratic way to go. I think people have to reach their own decisions, and you have to let them reach those decisions. The purchase age, I also concur that when you have a soldier who's defending this nation in a faraway place, to then tell him that he can't smoke a cigarette if that's what he wants to do. He's an adult. He can vote. He can serve. And he also ought to be able to smoke, even though we should be telling him that it's a bad decision. But that's education. That's not compulsion. The tobacco tax is very, very high as it is right now. Raising it a bit more is not going to make a major difference to the confirmed smoker. But what it may well do is further encourage black market tobacco, further encourage people to go across the borders to New Hampshire and New York, where cigarettes are in fact cheaper because tax rates are cheaper. So I don't think that that's a very good idea.
Ms. McCarthy.
As far as I'm concerned, as a child of two parents who smoked most of the years of my life, there is nothing good about tobacco from a public health standpoint or from a personal one. We need to do everything we can to support our young people and adults in quitting this expensive, health-devastating addiction. We need to use evidence-based prevention strategies to make sure that non-smokers never start. We also need to curb the vaping trend that so many young people are engaged in now. These e-cigarettes contain more nicotine than regular cigarettes, and they're being marketed to our youth as a good alternative to smoking. Let's change this story.
Thank you. Next question. What is your view of gun legislation that was passed during the last session? Do you believe the gun restrictions were appropriate or went too far? Are there other ways you would address the issue of gun violence, particularly in the schools and domestic violence? We'll begin with Mr. Tanner.
So I believe, this is where I break with some people in my party on this issue. I believe that some of the gun restrictions passed went a little too far, but I also strongly believe in some of the other things that were passed. I'm not a supporter of the bump stock ban, as I feel like that is really hard to enforce, and if you can't enforce a law, then it's not really a law. What I do support is the relief of abuse order, the take a gun out of the home of somebody suspected of domestic violence. I also support just taking guns away from people who are going to hurt themselves as well. I support those two things because when I was a 4-year-old, I came from a home of domestic violence, and if my father was into guns, I probably would not be here today. I think when it comes to preventing school shootings in our schools, well, it's hard to say you want to prevent school shootings in our schools when you're trying to cut guidance counselors, right? If you're cutting educational staff, then you're not doing enough. I've seen many students who have fallen through the gaps because they need that one teacher that was a casualty of the budget cut, right? That one teacher who, because the school had a budget that got voted down, position was eliminated, that student has fallen through the cracks. So what I would do to address gun violence and domestic violence was be starting in our schools, making sure our schools have the proper staffing to deal with students who are coming in with a whole different set of problems, along with expanding on things that make gun, hunter safety course, teach people how to use a gun, teach people how to respect a gun, along with beefing up our domestic violence supports, because those are woefully underfunded right now, along with our mental health support, both of which do not have enough money being pumped into them and create long-term problems.
Thank you. Senator Brock?
There were 3 bills before the legislature in the last session that related to guns. 2 of the bills, one dealt with relief from abuse orders, the civil side of taking guns away from people who posed a danger, and the second dealt with criminal abuse situations where people who were being placed under arrest for a variety of offenses, mostly domestic violence kinds of situations, could also have guns taken away. The key in those bills was that it was done, those removals were done while protecting the constitutional rights of the gun owner, as well as protecting the rights and lives of the people who were potentially threatened. We did it in a way that was both constitutional and also legal in all respects. That was critically important, and it was particularly interesting as that debate went on that we were able to get consensus, both from the gun rights advocates, the NRA, as well as people who were potential victims of gun violence, all came together in support of those 2 pieces of legislation. And those were good bills, in my opinion, and I supported them. We had a third bill, S-55, which was a bill that placed restrictions on firearms. I did not support that. The reason I didn't support it is because I saw no empirical evidence that any of the measures that were called for in that bill would prevent violence in any way, shape, or form. At the same time, what I saw is that they would infringe upon the rights of thousands of law-abiding Vermonters for no particular gain. I think we would have been much better spent had we spent our time looking at how to harden our schools, how to improve our mental health services for people who are at risk of gun violence, and to do a number of other positive things that other states have started doing that we're behind the ball on.
Ms. McCarthy?
I believe in Second Amendment rights. It's a fundamental part of our history, and especially here in Vermont, which is a proud hunting state. People should be able to protect themselves. And we need to listen to our children when they tell mommy and daddy that they're afraid to go to school. I'll also say this, our political system is breaking down. We're too polarized. We need to work with people across party lines. We need to stop seeing each other as enemies. We need to relate to each other as people. And we need to listen to each other. During the debate about gun safety and the Second Amendment, there was a lot of shouting, a lot of fear, and a lot of anger. But I want to particularly congratulate our gun-owning Republican colleagues who listened with their hearts as well as their minds. The legislature and the governor made a good decision. They struck the right balance. It was a compromise. And compromise may be a dirty word in today's polarized world, but I call it progress. Right now, we all need to take a deep breath and see how implementation goes. I think we need some cooling off time until we see how this policy plays out. We can protect the Second Amendment and our children. In fact, it's our duty to do this.
Representative Parent?
Like Randy, I voted for both S-221 and H-422. The real controversy this past session was around S-55. Now, there were parts of S-55 that I agreed with. I actually agreed with banning bump stocks. I don't think there's any reason for bump stocks to be out there. There were pieces I didn't agree with. I don't think the magazine ban's enforceable. 1, 2, even the universal background check piece is tough. We just had a news story last week where law-abiding citizens, up until they got caught, were buying guns and trading them for drugs. Bad people are going to do bad things and always work around the law. And so I support Second Amendment rights. It was written in our Constitution, it's who we are. It's our Article 16 rights here in Vermont, and especially in Franklin County. Now, when we want to have a conversation about what we can do in our schools, I agree with Randy. I think we could have spent more time talking about Harding in our schools. I was glad we were able to get some money in our capital bill to give out grants to public schools to help with safety measures, but there's more work we can be done. There's another race going on in this county, in the sheriff's race, and I've talked to both candidates about expanding school resource officers and having folks in schools who can have conversations with kids and get to know them and let them see the bright side of law enforcement, but also someone who's professionally trained to know when someone's having a bad day or having a couple bad days in a row, and just to say, hey John, why don't you come in and talk to me? And I think, we have to have those conversations, and we need to talk about mental health. Whether, our school systems, and one of the cost drivers in our school systems is that kids are coming into school with more and more problems, and we need to have a conversation about how we better address that and not leave that to professional educators, but allow folks who are professional, case managers or professionals when it comes to mental health are the ones who are working with our children on those aspects so we can deal with them better.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now. In 2005, Vermont established greenhouse gas reduction goals in the law that calls for a 50% reduction in emissions from the 1990 level of 8.1 million tons by 2028 and a 75% reduction by 2050. Vermont recently lost ground in achieving these goals. What, if any, role should the state government play in encouraging or mandating actions that would help Vermont get back on track? And we begin with Senator Brock.
Where did those numbers come from? Was there any empirical basis by which those numbers and goals were arrived at, or were they simply arbitrary numbers that someone wrote down and said, gee, this seems like a good thing that we ought to do? Based on my time in the legislature, I believe it was the latter. We all want clean air and we want clean water. And there are those who say that we're really doing an awful job of providing it right now, but if you have an iPhone, load an app called ISO to Go. And that's the independent system operator that operates electrical utilities in Vermont, or in New England, and you will find that we aren't using oil. We aren't using coal to produce electricity now. A great deal of what we produce right now is from sources that are relatively clean. Yes, we do still use some natural gas, but a much lower pollutant than the gases or the other products that we used beforehand. We need to continue our work in that area, but we are making very, very good progress in that regard. And when we closed the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant, the interesting thing is we went across the river and we simply bought our nuclear power from New Hampshire, and we're still doing that right now. But it's not producing greenhouse gases. I think we do need to review whether or not we have a realistic goal, because we have to balance our environmental goals with what it costs us to get there. And if we talk about, as many are right now in the environmental community, of adding a carbon tax to do that, we have to understand that a carbon tax affects our people, our Vermonters, and particularly those in Franklin County. The poor pay a much higher percentage for, quote, clean energy than do the wealthy. These costs are borne by the people that we have here in Franklin County who have to heat their homes and who have to drive to work. And we have to make sure that we have the right balance for all of us.
Ms. McCarthy?
I think that Vermont can lead the way on how to slow climate change and mitigate its negative impacts. Our commitment to the environment is clear, and state government should encourage actions that help us meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Support for renewable energy and the reduction of dependence on fossil fuels is an essential part of the picture. The Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network is making efforts to help towns reduce energy use and save money. Transit alternatives, including walkable, bikeable communities, should be supported for the health of our citizens, our economy, and our environment. Vermont exports $2 billion every year to buy mostly dirty energy from out of state. We can keep that money here in Vermonters' pockets by updating our renewable energy and efficiency efforts. We've made some progress on the electricity part of the energy use pie, but heating Vermont buildings and transportation still predominantly reliant on fossil fuel. We need to expand our support for efficiency beyond the electricity sector and give more flexibility for the use of efficiency funds to things like weatherization, especially for low-income Vermonters who can't afford to fill the fuel tank. We can solve a lot of the carbon problem by encouraging the use of electric vehicles and new heating and cooling technologies like heat pumps. Bus companies are now piloting the use of electric buses, and new electric vehicles are cheaper to maintain and run than gas-powered vehicles. The state could be guiding the deployment of the infrastructure to electrify the grid, making sure that buildings are ready for EVs and incentivizing efficiency over cheap construction. Coupling efficiency with the recommendations of the Solar Pathways Plan, especially as battery technologies get cheaper, we can get back on track towards our carbon reduction goals while providing more green jobs and boosting the Vermont economy. Some people promote a false choice between the environment and the economy, but efficiency and renewable energy investments are a win-win.
Representative Parent.
Sure. I think there's a lot we can do as a state to use cleaner energy. One of the big pieces, I was the ranking member of the Energy and Technology Committee the last 2 years. We passed legislation to really develop storage facilities here in Vermont and expand access to storage, which helps some of these renewable sources come in. We can buy more from Hydro-Quebec, which is still the cheapest, cleanest form of energy we have just across the border. We can support the construction of TDI under Lake Champlain, the power line that would bring more of that hydro electricity from Quebec down into southern New England, and at the same time provide about $400 million to clean up Lake Champlain and other waterways. We can do more flexibility as a bill that Randy and I took the lead on this year on allowing efficiency to be spent more flexible. Jay Peak wants to take a project, and I'm a hockey coach and on the hockey board here in town. They want to take the excess heat that comes off their hockey rink, and they can heat 2 hotel buildings with that heat. So we can use hockey rinks to heat buildings. That's pretty cool. But when it comes down, to this and what state government can do, there are 2 things I won't support. I will not support a carbon tax, and I will not, have not, and will continue to fight against industrial wind on our ridgelines.
Mr. Tanner.
Well, I think it's important to realize that climate change does exist. And I think everybody has noticed how some of the days are getting hotter, how some of the storms are getting stronger, and how some of the winters are getting colder than they were before. This is one of the hottest summers we've had on record. I think it's time we look at a couple of things. I think we should look at some market-based solutions. Vermont doesn't make oil, obviously, so we only import oil, and that's money we are spending. I'm not going to say something like a carbon tax, because the carbon tax that is being spread, the 88 cents, it's a myth, it's a lie. It's a false narrative that is being spread. I look at a few things that the Northwest Regional Planning Commission has done, where they have communities support energy plans. They submit their energy plan, and if the Regional Planning Commission approves it, it goes to the state for approval, because that will help bring our local communities into compliance with these goals that have been outlined. We also need to expand public transportation. There's not enough buses running in Franklin County. And GMTA, the busing in our state they've started to move. They're testing electric buses. So we could expand bus lines, we can expand bus routes, we can have an electric bus run through St. Albans in a couple of years here. That's a realistic goal that will cut out some of the pollution going into our air. I think it's really important for us to realize that some tough decisions are going to have to be made. Saving the environment is not about the people in this room. It's about our children. It's about our grandchildren. It's about leaving them something that they can live on, leaving them something that they can farm on, leaving them something that they will be able to have. We must do everything we can without hurting working class people to save our environment.
Thank you. The time frame for the mergers under Act 46 is coming to an end. There are some school districts that are very unhappy about the mandate, but yet there have been some successful mergers. Should the state continue its course, or should changes be made to accommodate those unhappy with potential mergers? And we begin with Ms. McCarthy.
The intent of Act 46 is to provide a quality education with a variety of educational opportunities to all students at a cost that maximizes operational efficiencies and gives schools the flexibility to manage, share, and transfer their resources. The idea of forced mergers flies in the face of what I know from experience. A successful merger relies on clear communication, connection, and collaboration. The Agency of Ed has said, quote, "Without the commitment of the communities to create a new definition of us, potential opportunities will not be realized and unification may be blamed for any encountered difficulties," end quote. I think it's critical for the State Board of Education to listen to what real and perceived barriers are for the districts that haven't merged. They need to really hear what these districts propose to do to meet the intent of the law. We need to look at all options and make decisions that work for our students and our communities, and we need to do this together.
Representative Parent?
Act 46 was probably the biggest piece of legislation that passed during my first year in the House, and I voted against it. It did have some of its benefits, and I think in some places it probably did make sense. Here in St. Albans, where you could bring city school, town school, BFA, and those school districts were incentivized, and the voters chose to do that. It was their choice. Where I really struggled with the piece of legislation is where we get to, well, twofold. One, I don't think it'll actually provide any long-term savings in our education system. I don't think we've seen long-term savings here in St. Albans as we look at almost a $60 million school budget across the board and tax rates that continue to climb. What I think, and then the other piece is these forced mergers. I mean, ultimately, we have to provide incentives as a state. Unfortunately, after the Brigham decision, we fund education at a statewide level, and I think what that really has done is removed some of that local control all on its own, because we can be responsible budgeting here in St. Albans, but Burlington can be up 10, 12, 14, 15, 16% and stick us with the bills. I think we need to figure out long-term how we reconnect that. And in some of these school districts, I think show them the cost of their system and allow them to make the decision on should they merge, should they, what decisions they should make with their school. But I don't think, Vermonters don't take kindly to being told what to do, and I think the mergers is the wrong place to go about it, especially in communities like Sheldon and Franklin that voted unanimously. Now, very rarely do everybody agree on one issue, but in these towns, they had votes, and everybody there voted one way, and I think we have to do our best as legislators to respect those local democratic decisions. My political ideology as a whole is government that governs best is at the local level, and I think if we can continue to push that and allow the voters on school budgets to actually see the impacts of their decisions, I think you'd see different votes across the state, and I think you'd see more folks engaged. Part of the good part of this process is being out to town meetings in Fletcher and being out in Franklin, and how they come together and have these town meetings that, quite frankly, we don't in St. Albans, and I think it's a detriment to our community.
Mr. Tanner?
So I worked at Fletcher School this past school year until my position was eliminated and I got a full-time position at the place I'm now. I was working at Milton High School as well, so going back and forth between two schools was eye-opening to me. Our students are falling behind at these smaller schools that have 60 to 70 kids in some cases, and in other cases, they are getting ahead by having that individual attention. My school district, originally Fairfield, was one that was brought into St. Albans, and there was some kicking and screaming that came with it, but I think the benefits that the smaller school gets now by being able to be in the same district as St. Albans City and St. Albans Town is really, it's amazing to see. I don't think we should force schools to merge, because forcing somebody to do something does not work. We've seen it time and time again with other points in life. If you ever have a kid and you tell your kid it's nap time and they don't want to take a nap, they're not taking a nap, right? But I think we should approach those school boards and say, what can we do to help you lower the cost of your budget? Because educational budgets are really hard to curb when, like Corey said, South Burlington are spending a lot, but we can't spend that much in Franklin or Sheldon because we don't have that type of tax base. I also think that moving to a school funding structure that is more apt, such as what the NEA has proposed with a income tax funding our schools, will help out a lot more, because right now older people who own property are handling the blunt of our school funding, and that's not fair to our children, and that's not fair to anybody, and it makes it so you don't want to buy property in Vermont. I wouldn't want to force these schools to merge, but I want to give them an incentive to merge and give them a reason, and while also telling these schools that we want to listen to them. It's time to listen to these schools because the schools are the heart of the community. The biggest place in Franklin is the school. The biggest place in Sheldon is the school. We cannot force them to merge unless if they're willing.
Senator Brock?
I went to a meeting in Franklin, and something that someone said there has registered with me almost more than anything I've heard in the past few months. And the person got up and said, you know, votes ought to count. We don't live in North Korea. And that's the feeling of a lot of people in smaller communities around Vermont, that the wise men in Montpelier have dictated that there's only one way to do this, and this is the way that everybody should do it, and so shut up and get in line. And that doesn't go over well with communities, particularly a community like Franklin that has among the highest test scores of any elementary school in the state and has consistently done so for the past 10 years with one of the lowest expenditures of any schools in the state. And I see this over and over again, and what the effect of it, and I'm concerned about, is instead of bolstering the public school system, it's going to take people out of the public school system. As towns like Franklin and some of the towns in the Northeast Kingdom vote to leave the public school system and to go independent in order to avoid the heavy hand of Montpelier and its dictates. And those are real concerns. Those concerns also represent cost concerns, as the cost of the education establishment at the state level becomes more and more apparent. In my mind, we should give substantial deference to local decisions regarding schools and school mergers, provided those decisions maintain equity and don't increase the cost for other towns and also provide educational quality. To that end, I intend to introduce, if elected or re-elected, legislation that will require the State Board of Education to give substantial deference to local communities when those conditions are met.
Thank you. Okay, final question. You have 30 seconds to answer this question, so it's an elevator speech sort of thing. Now, each of you will have the opportunity to deliver a 30-second elevator speech on what a vote for you will mean for local residents. We begin with Representative Parent.
Two things. First, the things you expect me to say: affordability, economic development, combating our opioid epidemic. But what I think more importantly, if you elect me as your next state senator, you'll have somebody who was born here, raised here, chose to build their life here. I bought my first home here. My wife and I just had our first child here. We're building our lives here. The decisions we're going to be making over the next 2 years, 4 years, 6 years are going to directly affect our lives here and our children's lives here. But we also understand, growing up here, what this community is about and who we are fighting for. So I'll end it at 30 seconds there.
Mr. Tanner.
You will have somebody, if you vote for me for senator, you will have somebody who listens to the working man. I made $18,000 last year. I understand that people are struggling. I understand that costs are going up. And I understand that young people don't have it great right now as a young person myself. I also grew up here, went to school in Fairfield, went to high school in Enosburg, and I've chosen to stay in Franklin County. I want to work to make Franklin County better for everybody. And I want to work to bring power back to the people.
Senator Brock.
I took a psychological test once for a job many years ago, and the conclusion was that I'm the kind of person who is able to look at the forest and each and every tree in it. And that's what I do in the legislature. I'm concerned about the big things that we do, things like tax structure commissions, things like reducing Social Security taxes for people under a certain income. I'm concerned about a variety of things like that, but I'm also concerned about the day-to-day things that affect Vermonters here. And those are the things that I concentrate on. Those things are what's important to every individual, and an awful lot of the constituent work that we do focuses on that.
Ms. McCarthy.
I'm a listener. I work with people with very different perspectives, and I bring them together to bring about positive change. I do that at the state level as a nonprofit CEO, and I have a track record of doing that in Franklin County in the public sector and as a small business owner. Let's work across party lines. Thank you for endorsements from across the political spectrum, from the Vermont conservation voters to Republican Senator Carolyn Brannigan. I'm Pam McCarthy, and I ask for your vote.
Thank you. How about a round of applause for all of our candidates tonight? I'd like to thank our candidates, Senator Brock, Pam McCarthy, Representative Parent, and Dustin Tanner, for being here this evening and participating in the St. Albans Candidate Forum. I also want to thank you, all of you in attendance, and those of you who are viewing at home, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us on this journey that leads up to Election Day. It's important that everyone get out and vote on Tuesday, November the 6th. Now we'll take a short break and we'll reconvene for the House of Representatives Forum at 7:45. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and special thanks to the candidates for being here to address the issues that St. Albans city and town residents feel are important. Now we'll focus on the race for the Vermont House of Representatives. I'd like to introduce the candidates in alphabetical order and their party affiliation. And they are Representative Lynn Dickinson, Republican; Jim Fitzgerald, Republican; Kate LaRose, Democrat; Mike McCarthy, Democrat; David McWilliams, Democrat; and Casey Toof, Republican. As with the first session that we had this evening, the questions will, the questions are going to focus a little broader in this session. They're going to focus on economic development, healthcare, education, transportation, employment, and gun legislation. Just like in the first session, candidates will have 2 minutes to answer each question, with the exception of the final question, in which they'll have 30 seconds to respond. Our timekeeper will flash a card when there's 30 seconds remaining and will then ring the bell when your time is up. I hope again that each of you will respect each other's time, and if you continue talking past the ringing of the bell, I'll respectfully ask that the next candidate begin answering. Candidates will address the questions in alphabetical order, with Representative Dickinson answering the initial question first, followed by Jim Fitzgerald being the first to answer the second question. And then, as with the first session, we'll continue to rotate through each of the candidates. As we listen to the candidates answer questions, once again, I would ask that the audience please hold your applause until the very end, so that we can get as much or have as much time as possible for the answers. So let us begin. Question number one. As with all of the counties in Vermont, Franklin County is experiencing a very difficult opiate epidemic. The consequences of this behavior are devastating on many levels, from personal and public safety to employability. What ideas do you have to combat the crisis to make Franklin County a leader in reducing the epidemic? And if there is a cost associated with your solutions, where would the money come from? And we begin with Representative Dickinson.
Thank you, Joe. This is a terrible epidemic in our community, and I know families have been touched by this epidemic. Either they have lost adult children or their grandparents that are raising their grandchildren because of the epidemic. One of the things that I did a few years ago was I sponsored a bill that allowed independent licensed alcohol and drug counselors to participate in Medicaid. Previous to this, only the designated agencies, the mental health agencies, could bill and be paid by Medicaid for treating patients or clients who had Medicaid. The independent LADCs were working with Medicaid-eligible people, but they were not able to get paid by Medicaid, and the clients had to pay out of pocket. It opened up many more opportunities when this bill finally passed for Vermonters to receive additional counseling regardless of the ability to pay. This actually started before we knew the extent of this opiate crisis, but it really hit home when the opiate crisis was really obvious. And it's an achievement that I'm very proud of, that the LADCs can treat patients regardless of ability to pay. We also worked on a saliva test in the session this year that came out of the transportation bill to determine drug impairment or help determine drug impairment on the highway with a real-time field test. It was a good start, and the House approved it in the transportation bill, but it was removed in the Senate Judiciary Committee by the chairman. I always found it sort of interesting that the people who were the most adamant and concerned about legalizing marijuana were the people who many times were against the saliva test. But the safety on our roads is really important, and this would be a start. It would be similar to the breathalyzer and data master tests that we use for alcohol. Also with this drug epidemic, I always find it sort of interesting and really disturbing that we're trying to legalize another drug. And, you know, we need to really work on.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
Joe, may I explain to the audience a little problem that I have? I did not receive the right questions. Thus, I answered questions relating to the Senate candidates and prepared to talk about those. So I apologize to you folks tonight, and I'll try to do the best I can without prepared notes. I hope you understand. For some reason or another, I didn't realize that the Senate questions were going to be different than the House questions. My computer didn't say that, so I'm not prepared in written form to answer the question. I'll do the best I can. I think the state of Vermont has led the nation in fighting this real problem that we have in this country, but much more to do. We usually are number one in the country, most things we try to do, sometimes good and sometimes bad. I think we've done a fairly good job with this problem. It boils down, ladies and gentlemen, to education. That's where it starts, with our young people, when they're young. We had a very unfortunate incident in my neighborhood 2 weeks ago, where a man actually committed suicide over the same issue. It's a terrible situation, a terrible problem. And I assure you that if I'm elected to the Vermont House, I will do all I can to fight this battle. Because right now, in this country, I believe we are losing it. And those who are partly responsible for the problem are not stepping up to the plate and assuming responsibility. The pharmaceutical companies have to be checked, the individuals have to be checked, and the government can only do so much for people. Some people have to do things on their own. The government can't be everything to everyone. And so I will work to get folks to educate at home, families, the parents, and teach their kids just exactly what they should be doing and not doing. It is not good today, and everybody must share the responsibility.
Thank you. Ms. LaRose?
Thank you. Unfortunately, around the country right now, we've gotten to the point where opiates are killing more people than gun violence. We don't want to see people die from either of those things, but that's to the point that we're at right now. So right now we have more than 115 people in the United States who are dying every day from overdosing on opioids. We know that roughly 21 to 29% of patients who are prescribed opioids for chronic pain misuse them. About 12% develop after an opioid use disorder, and 80% of people who use heroin first misuse prescription opiates. This is a problem. Here in Vermont last year, 107 people died from opiate overdoses in Vermont. This is the third straight year that this has happened. We will lead in Franklin County because we care. We will lead in Franklin County because we must. This is an economic issue. This is an issue for our neighbors and our family. This is an issue for our community. First, we're going to expand what's working. We're going to look at the evidence base, and we're going to expand recovery options for people wanting them. When people are ready to go into recovery, recovery needs to be there and waiting, not 5 months from now, now. Along those lines, Department of Health's hub and spoke addiction treatment system is something that is working. The BART clinic down the street is working. Safe Recovery in Burlington is working. We will look at making the overdose reversing drug Narcan more available around the state. We will continue to provide MAT in prison. That became available on July 1. We haven't seen it actually actualize yet, but that will continue and it will expand. We want to see prisoners getting that treatment. And we will limit and monitor painkiller prescriptions. We also want to expand public health surveillance. This is from National Institutes of Health. We need to see what's going on so that we can know what the full scope of the problem is. And how can we pay for it is the next part of the question. We're already paying for that. We know that we're paying for it. All we need to do is look at the community, look at the newspaper every day. We are paying for it. Right now, Vermont is spending $70 million in the last 5 years for opiate treatment programs, and we need to tax opioid producers.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy.
Thanks, Joe. I've lost 3 friends to opiate overdoses, and I know that this has touched everyone in our community, and so I get really emotional about this issue. And one of the things I get most emotional about is the fact that the pharmaceutical companies who created these drugs, like Purdue Pharma, they profited off the deaths of Vermonters. And I'm really proud that the Attorney General has joined other AGs in going after them for funds that we could use here to fund the treatment and recovery efforts that we need in order to deal with this crisis and to help people who are suffering from substance use disorders. One other thing we can do is continue our work reducing overprescribing. I was really glad the last time I was at the hospital to see posters warning people about how addictive these drugs really are. And our Northwest Medical Center has really led the way on changing practices in the culture, but we haven't done enough to take drugs out of medicine cabinets, and we're still overprescribing across the state, in spite of increased public awareness. We've got to shift spending away from prisons and into treatment. About half of the people who are in our correctional facilities right now are there for non-felony crimes, and most of the people who are in our correctional facilities have substance use disorders, and prison is not a good place to treat them. We should be embarrassed that we're spending money on private prisons like CoreCivic, and we need to bring those dollars back here to Vermont. Let's stop criminalizing this mental health crisis. I also agree with Kate that we need to continue to support Narcan availability and make sure that we're saving the lives. My friend Scott Pavic, who's in recovery, often tells me, we don't really have an opiate use crisis so much as we have an opiate death crisis. That's the bigger crisis, is that our friends and our family are dying. I want to continue to support medically assisted therapies and the hub and spoke model, but I want to expand on that and make sure that we're not just keeping people addicted for life. And I think that the way that we do that is by linking mental health with our substance treatment.
Mr. McWilliams?
Yes, first of all, I think the opiate problem has been caused by the pharmaceutical, and the doctors, in turn, sometimes what they do is they get a gift or to promote these drugs like oxycodone and stuff like that. And I think that we need to make sure that we take and control the substance like that, any regulated drug that is, that used for, what it should be used, only for pain. What the doctors do sometimes, they give them 30 days instead of 5 days medicine. I think we need to educate our kids in the school what the side effects of the drugs are, and I think marijuana in the state of Vermont was the bad thing to pass. I think we also have to look at educating our kids on what that does to them and their body. Also, I want to state that I did not get the questions ahead of time, and in fact, one of your people here called me and didn't know that I was actually running for office, so I never got the question. So what you get is what I say.
Okay. We will, in both cases, I do not know why that occurred, but we will get to the bottom of it. Mr. Toof.
Thank you. First, I'm going to start by saying I don't think there's too many families in our community that haven't dealt with this issue. It is a big problem, but I believe that St. Albans has been one of the front runners in addressing the opiate issue, and I believe that the hub and spoke system has worked state of Vermont in a real bipartisan effort over the last 7 years, and I think that's really good to point out that this is not a party issue. This is a real an issue that's facing our community. We've done a really good job to battle this in St. Albans. We've really taken we were one of the front runners in the state, or really in the nation to do this. I think it's time we talk about how we use the legal system in a punitive way to deal with drug dealers who victimize Vermonters. Are we doing enough to make sure that the dealers are being held accountable? We've done and will continue to fight policies that will help those struggling and their families, but I think this time we look at those consequences of those providing those drugs.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now to question number 2. The rural nature of our region creates transportation issues for those trying to find a job or keep a job, and for those in need of services. Where would you start in addressing this issue? And if there was a cost associated with your solution, where would that money come from? And we'll begin with Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you. The last term in the House that I served, I happened to serve on the House Transportation Committee. And one of the big discussions at that time was mass transit, commuter rail, and so forth. In fact, I'm the former general manager of the commuter rail that ran from Burlington to Middlebury and so forth, Howard Dean's project. I thought it had great potential. I still do, and there's an initiative underway here in St. Albans now as we speak to start up commuter rail in the future. Those are the things we have to do to reduce our transportation costs. Buses serve a wonderful service. They provide a wonderful service. I'm a train type guy. I think that the trains do better than the buses because they're so, they handle so many people in one vehicle, if you will, please. It's more difficult to manage transit rail because you can't put them in every town and city in the state of Vermont. That's just not feasible. There are things we can do. Where do we find the money? We find the money, ladies and gentlemen, in our existing $5 trillion budget. Some of it coming from the Transportation Fund, which is indeed a separate fund from the general fund. We can fund these programs if we button down and do things right and analyze our costs. One of the interesting things tonight with these questions is I don't see any that talks about reducing costs in our state government. It talks about new programs. I'm not for new programs, and I think mass transit and busing and pooling, of course, is the way to go to solve our transportation problems, or at least partial.
Ms. LaRose?
Thank you. As I go door to door, I've spoken with nearly 1,000 of my neighbors, and generally what I'm hearing when it comes to transportation is one of two things. I'm hearing people say, I want a job, I need multiple jobs, and I don't have transportation to get to the third shift. I don't have transportation to be able to drop my child off at childcare. You can't do that with a bus. And then on the other hand, I have folks who are employers, and they need people to fill those jobs. We're hearing it all the time from the folks down the road at Limna Drive. We hear it from people who are over at Ben & Jerry's and Peerless. They need workers. We have a very low unemployment rate. We have people who are underemployed, though, and need the money and can't get there based on public transportation alone. We need to continue to invest in public transportation. Yes, I agree with that, and it's not the only way. So one of the things that we need to look at is we need to look at how we can use, I agree with Jim, what is in our existing state budget and that's already being used on transportation, and use it in a better way that is going to help people fill those jobs, that's going to help people get the access to the transportation that they need. Here's a couple of examples. One is, why do people not have cars? In some cases, they do have cars, but there's been stricter adherence to car inspection laws, and now with those additional specks of rust, and yes, there's maybe some safety issues, but it might just be the engine light is on. So looking at providing support for people who have cars that are sitting in their carport that they can't use. The other thing that's happening around the country right now is prosecutors, attorneys generals, treasurers are looking at suspended licenses due to fines and fees, which is a criminalization of poverty, and getting rid of those. People who have a license, but because of fines and fees can't access that, can't get into the workforce again, that needs to be taken care of. And we also need to look at people who could have driver's licenses if they were able to have access to driver's education and to pay those fees.
Mr. McCarthy?
I had the pleasure of serving on the House Transportation Committee when I represented St. Albans a couple of years ago, and the issues around our rural state and transportation were always top of mind. It's very difficult if you live far away from the workplace and where services are to affordably commute. And one of the things that we really talked about is that in the long run, our land use and the incentives for development really need to focus on our downtowns, our village centers, and having people live closer to where they work. And lucky for us, the market trends are such that people my age and younger want to live in walkable, safe, and bikeable places that are where more people will be closer to the places that they work. But I think in Vermont, with the rural nature that we have here, we're going to continue to need to invest in new ways of last mile transportation for folks that need public transportation. When I was on the transportation committee, we talked a lot about using technology to make it more efficient to do things like schedule Medicaid services for when people need transportation to appointments. We've got the technology now where people can request appointments and we can trip chain and save a lot of money. So we can take the dollars we're already spending and for that last mile transportation that people need, do it better. There's an app that's under development for use by municipalities, cities, and states that's kind of like Lyft or Uber for public transportation. And I think for the last mile that we need, the technology is going to be our answer to solving that problem, combined with the kinds of mass transit like buses and rail. And right now, the rail freight, we need them to be partners on helping us with the commuter, because people in St. Albans, people are moving to St. Albans who are working in Chittenden County. They're moving to St. Albans, and if they're like me, I would love to be able to take a train and to drop me off near Waterbury to go to the Sun Common office. So the train that people like Charlie Moore are working on right now is a really exciting avenue to have us reduce our carbon footprint, get people to work cheaper, and then that last mile problem is the one we're really going to have to solve.
Mr. McWilliams.
Well, I think the mass transportation is, we don't do enough. At one time, I think the state of Vermont looked into having a commuter one coming from St. Albans to Essex Junction to help out with IBM and some of the factories down in there. The bus companies that we have now, I don't think there's enough of them going around to pick up people at times when they need to go to work. I know there's the GMTA bus that goes up to Richford and brings them down to Peerless and the industrial park. I think we got to do more to get people to often the social services and get them to work, because they want to work if they got transportation to and from it. But also you have to remember that the daycare costs and for people who have children is outrageous in the state of Vermont, because the state of Vermont regulations made it so that people can't afford to go to work when they pay $150 a week for childcare. We also have to make sure that we fund it through the transportation tax, but also we need to make sure that we take and use that money wisely, because our roads and our bridges are shot. I know we get some money from the federal government, but traveling up through Fairfield, East Fairfield, Fairfax, the roads are deplorable, and some of our bridges on 89 are deplorable. So I think we've got to make sure we use our money wisely and use it for what it should be.
Mr. Toof.
Yeah, I understand that it's hard for people in rural areas to find good employment and find a way to work, but I think part of this stems from the affordability crisis facing our state. Not being able to find a job is the very crux of the affordability crisis. I too have spoken to I've been at 2,500 homes, and I've talked to many people. The number one issue, over 95% of the people I've spoken to, it's too costly to live here. Healthcare costs, education spending are crippling our ability to fund other important priorities like transportation or economic development in more rural areas, so folks don't have to travel nearly as far as they do now to get a job or seek services. We have a budget we've talked about this, with $5 billion that I think we could work within to find the money that we need. So I think job creation and workforce development would be a main focus for me. Thanks.
Representative Dickinson.
Thank you, Joe. There is a problem for our residents living outside the populated areas, and I think it is, like Casey said, a symptom of affordability. I also think it's a symptom with our development and job creation that is tied to Act 250. We cannot continue to use see job development only in Chittenden County. People in rural communities need to be able to work and get services where they actually live. We need to have some kind of way to organize our development in rural areas. Act 250 reforms recently have concentrated on providing relief from the criteria for our larger towns and cities, our designated downtowns and growth areas. Everywhere else is coming more under the stringent review with 9L, which was added to Act 250 a few years ago. Unfortunately, it just creates pockets of poverty out in the rural areas. We were once concerned about sprawl, but that really isn't the problem. The problem is that people don't have any way to have jobs and to live close to where they are. If everything's in Chittenden County or even just in St. Albans, it's more difficult for people outside the area. I have introduced legislation to update and reform Act 250 in the past, and that would give the rural areas a better chance to create jobs and prosperity, because ultimately It's creating jobs that will create a solution to both the transportation, to the affordability crisis, and that we want to have the prosperity spread throughout the entire state and throughout the entire county, not just in small pockets of population.
Thank you. Given that RISE Vermont, the Department of Health, and a University of Vermont researchers' measurement study showed that 41% of first, third, and fifth graders in Franklin and Grand Isle counties are overweight or obese, how will you as a legislator make healthy eating and obesity prevention a priority? And what policy advancements will you support to help our children have healthier futures? We begin with Ms. LaRose.
Thank you. I appreciate this question quite a bit. We know that 3 behaviors in this state cause 4 diseases, which then in turn cause 50% of deaths in this state. And those 50% of deaths and those 4 diseases are a driver of our healthcare costs that we are paying for in this state, and it's going to grow exponentially into the 10 years in the future. This is something that has to be addressed. This isn't healthy eating for healthy eating's sake. This is healthy eating for our economy's sake and for our future generations' sake. Right now I have a 5-year-old. He just started school. He started school at City School, and he rides the bus every day. And one of the things that I'm so impressed with is that when he gets there, he and all of his classmates are offered in their classroom universal school meals. They're offered universal breakfast and lunch. And having universal school breakfast and lunch is a wonderful program where schools are able to provide that. It ties into the curriculum. It teaches kids all about nutrition. It teaches them where their food comes from and getting us back to our roots and what healthy eating looks like, especially here in Franklin County where we have a farm economy. I think also we need to look at food quality and making sure that we're increasing participation for schools and connecting them to farms for more resources there. And we really need to look at doing what RISE Vermont is doing in increasing physical activity, things like walking school buses, making wellness programs very accessible. The healthy choice needs to be the easy choice. It needs to be the default choice.
Mr. McCarthy?
We had a really great time, a few of us, going to the Flack family farm this weekend and seeing rural, local, healthy food being produced, and a food philosophy that's really different from the kind of mass production and the industrial food that we all consume way too often, and that causes a lot of the obesity crisis that we have right now. The Farm to Plate initiative and bringing that local food into schools is a really good start, but it's only the beginning, and the barriers to getting the food that's produced locally onto our plates are really huge from an economic perspective because it's more expensive than cheap, high-calorie, low-nutrient food. So I want to really think about how we continue to support things like shared working spaces, food hubs, and distribution networks that will allow more of the food that's produced in Vermont to get onto Vermonters' plates affordably. Kate mentioned how it's so great, and my daughter goes to city school too, that they have access to a community garden, that they're seeing how food is produced, that they're thinking and being taught about the connection between healthy food. But we don't incentivize right now in our healthcare system wellness and lifestyle medicine the way we should. And as we make the shift away from fee-for-service, the Green Mountain Care Board and through healthcare reform, we actually should be helping RISE Vermont, our hospitals, get paid to have us be healthier. And we're starting to move in that direction. But healthy food's got to be a part of that. So when I talked to Dr. Fontaine and I talked to Jill Berry Bowen about the future of health in Franklin County, the hospital is a key partner in educating us, helping us move in the right direction around healthy food. And Dr. Fontaine will give me a really hard time for eating French fries if she ever sees me doing that. We have a healthcare system that is constantly driven by what's really sick care. We're really just we're trying to constantly put out fires. If we incentivize wellness instead of just treating the acute problems that people have, we'll be in much better shape financially.
Mr. McWilliams?
Well, I think the obesity it starts in two areas, in my opinion. First, at home, we need to provide the parents with stuff to educate their kids on the quality of food that we're eating. If we do that, along with the school meals that are provided, we will make sure that their kids are not obese as they are right now in today's education. We also need to make sure that we support RISE Vermont and the quality the work that they're doing to promote this. I think that if we take and turn it around by educating our parents and our kids in reference to the quality of food, we need to make sure that they have the money to do it. And the wages in the Franklin County throughout the state, a family cannot live on $15 an hour, but I would support $15 an hour and a two-tier wage for students that are in high school. If we don't provide enough money to give them the sources to buy the food, then they're still going to have this overweight problem throughout Franklin County.
Mr. Choof?
My main focus when I go to Montpelier will be trying to make Vermont more affordable. It goes back to the same thing I was just talking about. The only way we'll have enough money to fund these kind of initiatives is if we grow the economy and grow the workforce. There are people running this year that want to increase the burden on working Vermonters by continuing to raise revenue and continue to make it continue to ask more and more from Vermonters. If we want the ability to fund this and other incredibly worthy causes, we need to get the state's fiscal house in order first.
Representative Dickinson?
Thank you. I have two children who go out to the schools with a group called Small Town Big Smiles. They go into the schools and they talk about nutrition and why we should avoid bad food and eat more good food. There are some obvious simple solutions. This is obviously education is one aspect of it, but there are simple solutions that don't require legislation, but as parents and as a community we can promote. We should get our kids off the devices, off the video games, put away the iPads, stop watching TV and go outside and start to move. My daughter worked with a group after-school program here at City School called Run Girls Run for a few years, and this is exactly the kind of activity we need to reach out to our young people to make them more physically active. Some sports require skill and time and money and equipment, but walking, running, dodgeball, other after-school activities that are simple and that kids can do anywhere. They don't cost anything, and it's the type of activity we should be encouraging. And my observation as a grandparent is that there are a lot of school programs are being done in these after-school programs. YMCA has one in Georgia. There are others in the area. And it's a help for working parents as well as for the kids to get out and to play and to be able to do this physical activity. And it provides a perfect opportunity for getting the kids to move and get more active. You can also do a lot of education and after-school programs about food and nutrition. So I think we should do more of that.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzgerald?
I think the school systems have come a long way in the last 15, 18, 20 years in teaching kids and parents also all about healthy foods and what their children should be eating. I agree that the schools play a great role. I'm not so fond of our government playing a role in this matter, and I'll tell you why. The school systems presently, in many cases, are deleting phys ed and recess. That doesn't make sense. If you're trying to build healthy kids with healthy foods and proper exercise and so forth, why is the school system deleting some of the principal programs that we really need to achieve that goal? I think the legislature can be helpful, and I think they have been helpful. I think they've come a long ways in recognizing what is good for a child and what is not good for a child. I don't think it's necessarily the government role, Montpelier, if you will, to regulate that. I think the parents have to start from the household with the child, and it starts with the household and the child and the mother and father. I can help as a legislator bring back information to the parents and provide information to the parents that would be helpful in their way in the way they help to achieve the end goal. Again, it's what can my government do for me, and I'm generally opposed to anything of that sort.
Next question. St. Albans City has benefited significantly from having been approved for a tax incremental financing district. Yet the state auditor has criticized the program, arguing that the investment St. Albans has experienced would have happened even without being a TIF district. If elected, would you support new TIF legislation which would allow other communities to take advantage of the program? And what would you say to the state auditor if he were sitting in the audience this evening? We'll begin with Mr. McCarthy.
I love this question. So when I came back to St. Albans, we had about 50% vacancy rate in the downtown. It was a tough place to think about people investing. And what we've seen as we've come together using multiple creative ways of financing our revitalization is that the dollars we've put in and the partnerships that we've made have led to a huge private investment. And when I was in the legislature, I remember being in the House Institutions and Corrections Committee and trying to convince them that it was a good idea to sell the state office building and Dominic Cloud was there and doing a great job. He's our city manager. And he was saying, hey, the dominoes are going to fall. So if we do this, then we've got this strategy where we're going to be able to do a hotel and a parking garage, and the co-op is going to expand, but it's only going to happen if all of these infrastructure pieces come together. And but for tax increment financing that allows us to use that new tax increment, that new revenue, it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have seen this revitalization. I've been on the downtown board I was on the downtown board throughout the Main Street revitalization, and now I've been on the city council for a year and a half. We were able to be successful with TIFs because we had fiscal discipline, we had a strategy, we had an incredible staff, we had community support. And for other communities that can put those things together and prove to the state that they'll do a good job, I would tell my friend Doug Hoffer in the state auditor's office that if they've got a good strategy, they've got community support, they've got the ability to make investment, but for some public investment, that we absolutely have to support them with creative financing. That's how we grow the economy in our downtowns, without having to raise taxes on people out in the neighborhoods. And that's kickstarted our ability to be able to do things like the neighborhood sidewalk program. That's real revitalization. That's what I want to take down in Montpelier. The experience we've had here in St. Albans can happen other places. We've got to do it carefully, but we can do it.
Mr. McWilliams?
Well, I think the TIF district, worked for the city of St. Albans because, face it, this downtown was dying and we needed something to do it, to improve it. What the city has done is really improve the downtown. I think it brought a lot of businesses back to downtown. And I also feel that the money, as long as the taxpayers of the city of St. Albans are not on the whole, if this TIF district goes south. Because, let's face it, there's a lot of houses in the city of St. Albans that are up for sale because of the, high cost of taxes everywhere. And the taxes in the city, I was talking to a gentleman the other day, that his taxes went up $300. So living on North Elm Street. So I think, if the TIF is working and there's not going to be any taxpayers that own their homes that are going to be liable for it, maybe it's a good thing. But I just hope in the future that we don't see a lot more houses for sale in the city of St. Albans.
Mr. Toof?
Yeah, the question was, would you support new TIF legislation? Yes, I would. You don't have to go too far to see what has happened in our downtown. Go right outside the door here. Take a look at places like the St. Albans Co-op, Mylan, just the city streetscapes themselves. Talk to people that were involved in the project. They'll tell you how great of an experience this was to help make our community better. The list really goes on and on. Our community looks better than it ever has. I want to give give credit again to a company like Walmart that came in. I think that has something to do with that because they were able to keep people here in Franklin County, here in St. Albans. They're spending their money here, they're shopping here, they're staying here, they're coming downtown. They're not running to Burlington every time they need something. So that's where I would give credit to them. We've had a really big lack in this community since Ames and Woolworths have gone out, and I think that's helping it grow. And I think other communities within the state should have the ability at the success that we've had. Places like Newport is a great example that could use that type of support. Thank you.
Representative Dickinson?
Thank you. The TIF is a mechanism to help communities build infrastructure to encourage growth in the community. It's not a tax abatement. The property owners in the TIF district continue to pay their education property taxes, but the municipality with the TIF keeps some of the education property tax and does it send it to the state education fund. This way, the city and town can use this money that it gets to keep to pay off the bond for the municipal programs that they're sponsoring. Our auditor does not like the program. He also doesn't like the VEGI program, which is the Vermont Economic Growth Incentive, which is another thing that we use to help promote business and help create jobs for people. And some of our communities have actually, some of our companies here have actually taken advantage of that. Both use the but-for standard, that the project would not have been done but for this incentive. And his argument is the background growth would have happened anyway, and that these incentives are unnecessary. It's interesting to note that the majority of the TIFs that are in existence already, or most of them are in Chittenden County. Something like Burlington has 2 or 3 of them. Milton has a couple of them. It took a while for St. Albans City to take advantage of this, but we do see the results of it here. I do agree also, one of the things that we have with places like Walmart, which took 20 years to be approved under Act 250, is that it pays its full taxes to the community, and it does encourage people to stay here to shop, which is really, and it makes it affordable. That obviously helps the city as well. So there's collaboration here between the two communities, and I do think that the TIF has helped. But I do know that other people don't necessarily agree with it, including the auditor.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I guess I'm jealous of Mayor Gamache and all her achievements along with the fine city council. Take a look out front here. Go up and down Main Street of St. Albans. And then as a legislator, you tell me it would be unwise to support TIF in this state. This is amazing out here, what we have in St. Albans and the achievement that's been made over the years. I had none of those tools when I was mayor. And again, I want to thank Mayor Gamache and her leadership for all the great achievements they had. I wished I'd had that program. I did not. It's a wonderful program. It's something that I never thought as a lifelong citizen of St. Albans that I would see. I played basketball in this gymnasium as a young boy. The TIF program works. And if you don't think so, read of all the cities and towns are fighting like mad to get some of that funding in their communities. Yes, I will support that if elected to the House.
Ms. LaRose?
I love Vermont. Only in a place like Vermont could you read a report, then see this question and say, gosh, I don't think that's what I saw in that report. This question seems off. I don't think the state auditor said that. And you can pick up the phone, you can call the state auditor and talk to him before lunch. So that was pretty cool to be able to do that. That's one of the things I did today. And when I spoke with Doug, I asked him about this, and he said, no, I didn't say that. That was not what I said. What I said was, in my job as an auditor, is to look at and see what the return on investment is on a certain program. That's his job. He said that he can't do that with this program because of the way it's set up. So he said, I don't like it, I don't dislike it. It's just from an auditing perspective, I can't look at the return on investment. So just want to clarify that. Secondly, I think Vermont can be really proud, or St. Albans can be really proud of what we have going on outside on the Main Street. I agree with everyone here. So with $16 million in bonds, we generated $80 million in new tax base over 5 years. To put that into perspective, that's 4 Walmarts. Walmart was $20 million in tax base. This is $80 million. And the way that we did this is by having a city council and a city manager and a mayor and private-public partnerships that came together and that managed this really well. So for example, they had to clean up the brownfield sites. They had to buy the land. They had to deed access to the parking garage. They had to invest $1 million of their own into this project. When that happens well, it works. When it doesn't happen well, you have Bell Stinger, you have Newport, you have a hole in the middle of downtown. One of my roles as your legislator is to be tasked with making the best choices with limited funds. I will always be asking for more information. I don't think any program can be given a carte blanche.
Thank you. Please pick A, B, or C for the following question and explain why. Do you believe the gun legislation passed during the last legislative session, A, needs to be reversed, B, will work fine just the way they are, or C, additional measures are needed? And we'll begin with Mr. McWilliams.
Well, first of all, I think probably most of the households in the state of Vermont do have a gun. I have at least 3 or 4. I think if we're going to take away the guns of our residents in the state of Vermont, then there's going to be a revolution, in my opinion. As far as having the right to bear arms, everybody should be able to have that right. But also the ones that are the criminals, our court system is not working right. They're not being, penalized more or sent to jails for a longer period of time. So I think that, until we take and, get the people that are the criminals off the streets and off the roads, then we're still going to have the problem. Having guns in Vermont, you'll never take anybody's gun away from them if they're a law-abiding citizen.
Mr. Toof?
I don't think additional measures are needed. There are things on the gun legislation that was passed this last legislative session. I agreed and disagreed with both. But I feel the real issue is school safety. I think that's what we really need to focus on going forward. I have 2 small boys who are about to go to school in the next few years. And it's a real concern for our family and myself to think about, sending kids off to school and the issues that surround that. So we need to look how we address making schools safer. The governor recently pushed to get $5 million to improve school safety measures throughout the state, and that's something that I would continue to push for going forward.
Representative Dickinson?
Thank you. As a grandmother of 7 who are all starting to attend school, I want to keep our schools safe for the children and the people who work there. It's one of the most important things we can do as citizens. My heart goes out to all those families over the years who have lost children and loved ones in these awful events. This is a community effort we must all continue to work on. It won't be solved overnight, and it may not always be solved with legislation. I had the privilege to be invited to the community day at BFA and speak to the students and listen to some of the other speakers. And, it was a very, very interesting session that the teenagers put on. One of the bills that we passed, S-221, I think is probably one of the most important bills that we did. This is a bill that is the extreme risk red flag bill that goes and finds a way to remove firearms from the place of someone who is either showing signs of distress, anger, physical harm to themselves or others, and perhaps some mental instability. We really need to have that kind of thing done, and it does it with protecting the due process procedures that protect their rights. I also, in 2011, put in a bill that asked the Department of Education to expand and support school advisories as a tool to help make sure all students have a relationship with an adult in the school, that no student falls through the cracks and goes unnoticed. This is an important fact for these students who are isolated or who have mental health issues. Another example of community effort is what Chief Gary Taylor is doing with the Survive Vermont effort. He's trying to work with schools, employers, and other institutions. He had a meeting here last March and had a lot of people from around the state. This is the See Something, Say Something, an important part of helping to create prevention. He also talked about the Run, Hide, Fight, and Stop the Bleed. It was very, very valuable.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I share the belief of many others that the basic problem with school safety and safety of the general public in general is our lack of good judgment and a good job repairing, if you will, the mental capacity and the problems that many of our citizens have in this country today. The problem, as I see it, is that gun laws don't work. Chicago, Illinois is an example. Toughest gun laws in the United States. 30, 20, 25, 22 homicides every single weekend. Every weekend. They don't work, ladies and gentlemen. There is no proven record that they work, but completely the opposite. They don't work in many cases. We have to have a better presence in our school system. We can walk in the school system in the state of Vermont today, believe it or not, and not be identified and not have identification. That's wrong. I thought we were doing a better job than that. There are some schools today you can still walk in, proven. In this country, in Vermont, we need to enforce that and do a better job doing that. But the gun laws themselves are not going to work. I think and credit to Governor Scott and the legislature and the folks who voted for gun legislation thought they were doing the right thing, and perhaps in some cases they did do the right thing. The bump stocks, you can't enforce that. That's unenforceable. And some of the gun laws are unenforceable, and they're finding that out right now. People have guns in this state, and they're going to continue to have guns, and I hope they're responsible enough to use them wisely.
Ms. LaRose?
Thank you, Joe. We want public policies and laws in this state that make us safer. That's what they're here for. And we know that protecting our families and communities from gun violence tops this list. We've heard it from everyone here on this panel so far, and I believe that most everyone here would say that, if not everyone. Also, we know that supporting the Second Amendment goes hand in hand with keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Acts 92, 97, 94, we've heard from folks that these are good things, keeping guns out of the hands temporarily of people who are dangerous. They pose an extreme risk to themselves or others, where there's domestic violence situations, where there is background checks in private cells. We want to expand those. We want to make sure that that happens. We want to raise the purchase age to 21. That's what these gun bills did. These are common sense gun laws. They will keep us safer. We know that no law is 100% effective and enforceable. For example, drinking and driving is illegal. People still do it. I wonder how many people in Chicago got DUIs over the weekend. I bet it was a lot. That's not an excuse, though, to shy away from public policies that are known to save lives and make us safer.
Mr. McCarthy?
I'm going to be the one person who takes the multiple choice bait and say that I'd go with B for now. I think that we need to continue to have a conversation about public safety, about whether the policies that were enacted are really effective. And I struggle every day when I think about, so I put my daughter on the bus and she goes to school, and we have a culture that's really changed around guns. So we hold up this idea that responsible gun owners are the norm. And I think that responsible gun owners are the norm in Vermont predominantly, but increasingly we see some really disturbing violence in our community from people who are not responsible gun owners. There was a young man who got in a fight with his girlfriend 2 doors down from me, and I heard him shoot himself while I was watching TV. There was a man who shot at the police a few months ago. There was another man who we referenced who shot himself, and I want to think about, take the emotion out of it as a policymaker, and say, can we come together, people who are responsible gun owners, protect their rights, make sure that both the Vermont and the US Constitution are respected, but also say, are there things that we can do as public policy makers that will make our community safer? That's a conversation that's worth having. We should continue to have that conversation. I don't think that it's over, but I don't see new legislation really coming down the pike this session while we're in the wake of this big debate. And I'm going to keep my ears open, I'm going to keep my door open, and I want to keep talking with people about how we balance our real concern about the safety of our kids and our families and our streets with the rights that we all cherish.
Thank you. Now, each of you will have an opportunity to deliver a 30-second elevator speech on what a vote for you will mean for local residents. We'll begin with Mr. Toof.
Thank you for having us tonight. This is a very interesting time to be running for office. I did this in 2012, and I have to say it's very disappointing to see how our politics have gone since then. I want to start by saying I applaud everyone up here running. I appreciate the effort everyone's put in. There's a lot of effort, I can tell you. But the reality is that we can't lose focus that for 8 years we've had a single-party rule in Montpelier with no balance of opinion that led to higher fees and over $1 billion growth in government spending. If elected, you can count on me to fight every day for the people of St. Albans. Thank you.
Representative Dickinson.
Thank you. I've served in the legislature for 10 years and served on the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee, the Corrections and Institutions Committee, and the Judiciary Committee. I've introduced legislation on issues important to the town and region, often to address the concerns of my constituents. I will continue to work with anyone for comments on solutions that improve the lives of Vermonters, and I ask for your vote. Among the things that I've been involved with in education over many, many years have included Title I preschool, bringing Community College of Vermont here, involved with BFA, and so on.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Mr. Moderator, may I start by expressing appreciation for the retiring Kathy Keenan. Thank you for your service. What will you get with Jim Fitzgerald in the House? You'll get loyalty, you'll get common sense approaches to all the problems, and you'll get a good communicator who will communicate with the community and the people that he serves. I've been in the House for a number of years, way back in 1969 when Dean Davis was governor of this state, and a fine governor. And I learned a lot from Governor Davis. Be loyal, be truthful. As difficult as it is to be truthful at times, it's necessary. And the people who hire you, that's the least they can ask from you. That's what you'll get from me.
Ms. LaRose?
Thank you. Leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. JFK. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. Martin Luther King Jr. Don't find fault, find a remedy. Henry Ford. With me, you will get someone who will learn, who will listen, who will build consensus, and who will find remedies for St. Albans.
Mr. McCarthy?
Thanks so much for putting on this forum. It's a great opportunity to talk to people about the things that matter the most to us as a community. And with me, you'll get somebody who's focused on achieving goals of having a healthy, prosperous Vermont and representing the people here with ideas that aren't about necessarily new programs or new spending, but it's about putting the priorities that we have first of our kids and our families and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to thrive, and then figuring out how we implement those priorities, how we achieve those goals. I'll do that for you.
Mr. McWilliams?
Well, if you like me, at least I'm going to be a person that ain't afraid to speak up. And I think most of the people know me that I'm straightforward and I believe in fighting for the rights of the taxpayers. The taxes in the state of Vermont are out of control and we need to do something to control it, either through, all these agencies that there are so many out there that, you can't keep track of, and the permitting process locally, we just built a building, 3,200 square foot building, $21,000 in permits. We need to get this permitting process under control. We also need to get a livable wage and not a wage that people can't afford to buy food and put on their table.
Okay. Thank you, David. The first thing I'd like to do as we close is thank Kathy Keenan, Tricia Woodward, and Jackie Hood for helping with the timing this evening. And you've mastered the bell, which is... I'd also like to thank our candidates, Representative Dickinson, Jim Fitzgerald, Kate LaRose, Mike McCarthy, David McWilliams, and Casey Toof for being here this evening and participating in the St. Albans Candidate Forum. I also want to thank you, the audience, once again for being here this evening, and for those who will be viewing on Northwest Access Television. As we lead up to the journey of Election Day, keep in mind it's critically important that you vote on Tuesday, November the 6th. I want to thank all of you for being here. Have a great day, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.